Hidden Figures by Margot Shetterly, Chapter 20. Degrees of Freedom. In February 1960, as the Space Task Group pushed forward with tests of the Mercury capsule, 4 students from North Carolina Agricultural and Technical, a black college in Greensboro, North Carolina, sat down in the whites-only section of the lunch counter at a Woolworth's drugstore. David Richmond, Franklin McCain, Azell Blair, Jr., and Joseph McNeil tried to order a cup of coffee. The staff refused to serve them. The manager asked them to leave, but the students refused to leave until the store closed later that night. That nonviolent protest was just the beginning of what would become a new phase of the civil rights movement. The following day, the Greensboro Four had turned into 20 activists. On the third day, 60 students gathered at the Woolworths, and on the fourth day, 300 had joined the demonstration. Within a week, similar peaceful protests had spread to other cities in North Carolina and then into Kentucky, Tennessee, and Virginia. The students called their protests sit-downs or sit-ins. Sometimes the police arrested the protesters and took them off to jail. The prison sentences that followed didn't discourage the activists. They did not intend to back down until they had defeated segregation. Protests in Hampton. Hampton Institute in Virginia, the school from which Mary Jackson graduated, was the first school outside of North Carolina to organize a sit-in. The college had a direct link to the civil rights movement. 5 years before, Rosa Parks, a seamstress in Montgomery, Alabama, had refused to give her a seat on the bus to a white man, triggering a bus boycott led by Martin Luther King Jr. Parks received death threats, and she and her husband were fired from their jobs in Alabama. The president of Hampton Institute offered Parks a job working as a hostess at the university's faculty dining room. She accepted, and she worked there from 1957 to 1958. When the sit-ins came to Hampton years later, Christine Mann, who had left her home in North Carolina behind to attend college in Virginia, was an 18-year-old junior. She wanted to pursue a career in the sciences, but her father insisted that she also earn a teaching certificate as a backup plan in case she had trouble finding work. In addition to taking courses in math and physics, Christine became involved in the civil rights movement. In protests that resembled those in Greensboro, Christine and some of her classmates marched to the lunch counter at the local drugstore in downtown Hampton. They tried to order food, but the attendants at the counter refused to serve them. So they then sat, reading and working on homework assignments. They were quietly protesting. When they refused to leave, the owner shut down the store in the middle of the afternoon. The next month, 500 students staged a peaceful protest in downtown Hampton. "We want to be treated as American citizens," said the outspoken leaders of the student movement. "If this means integration in all areas of life, then that is what we want." The Hampton Institute campus was alive with the possibility of significant social change. Christine also joined voter registration drives, walking door to door in black neighborhoods, urging residents to register to vote in November 1960 elections. A rumor circulated on campus that the astronauts supported the student protests. The astronauts represented mainstream America. The very idea that those buzz-cut middle American men were standing with the student activists, adding their voices to the call for equal opportunity for all Americans, was thrilling. It didn't matter if it was true, it inspired them either way. Progress at Langley in the 1960s. The culture was changing at the Langley Research Center, too. When Dorothy Vaughan turned off the lights in the West Area Computing Office for the last time, she and the remaining women in the segregated pool were sent out to other divisions at the lab. The era of the West Computing, a separate division for African American women, was over. Dorothy Vaughan was assigned to the newly built computer complex on Langley's west side. By the 1960s, Langley had centralized its computing operations into a group named the Analysis and Computation Division. It served all of the center's research operations as well as providing electronic computing services to outside contractors. In the new division, Dorothy was reunited with many of the West computers, as well as with other women who had worked in East computing. More striking than the racial integration of the female mathematicians was the fact that men had joined the team. Computing had been promoted in status from being an all-female service organization to a respected co-ed division. Computing was no longer considered women's work. However, with the increasing use of computer technology and aeronautical research, some of the older women at Langley, who still did most of their work using the older model mechanical calculators, fell out of touch. The early 1960s were a time of change in the history of computing, a dividing line between the time when computers were human and when they were machines. Computing jobs were no longer handed off to a room full of women punching numbers into $500 mechanical calculating machines. Room-sized computers that cost more than $1 million each now did the same work, and did it many times faster. Faced with this new era in computing, 50-year-old Dorothy Vaughan reinvented herself as a computer programmer. Engineers still came to her and asked for help. Now, instead of assigning the task to one of her staff or doing the computations herself, she programmed the calculations into an IBM computer and let the machine do the math. In the past, Dorothy would have set up the equations in a datasheet and showed one of the women computers how to fill it out. As a computer programmer, she converted the equations into the computer's language, Fortran, by using a special machine to punch holes into 7/3 by 1/3 inch cards. Each card represented one set of instructions for the computer. The longer or more complex the program, the more cards Dorothy and another programmer fed into the computer. The machines could not take more than 2,000 cards or 2,000 lines of instructions. Even modest programs could require a tray of hundreds of cards, which had to remain in the correct order. As powerful as the computers were, Project Mercury required even more electronic brain power than Langley had available. At the end of 1960, NASA purchased two IBM 7090 computers and installed them in the state-of-the-art facility in Washington, D.C. That computer lab was part of the Goddard Space Flight Center, which opened in 1959 in Greenbelt, Maryland. NASA established a third computer data center in Bermuda. Together, these three computers would be able to monitor and analyze all aspects of space flights from launch to splashdown. Keeping in touch. Orbiting Earth presented a number of communication challenges for NASA engineers. It was one thing to have a flight take off from Cape Canaveral, Florida, and land in the Atlantic Ocean. These flights stayed within the communication range of Mission Control in Florida and data centers in D.C. and Bermuda. Orbital flight missions that sent an astronaut around the globe were much more dangerous. The aircraft would pass out of visual and radio contact with Mission Control for extended periods of time. NASA demanded constant contact with the astronaut every minute of every orbit. The engineers at Langley had to build a worldwide communication network between Mission Control and the orbiting spacecraft. Developing the two-way communication and tracking network was almost as challenging as building the spacecraft itself. It required the creation of 18 communication stations set up around the globe so that the orbiting astronaut was never out of touch. The computers also sounded the alarm at the first sign of trouble. Any deviation from the projected flight path, evidence of malfunction on board the capsule, or abnormal vital signs from the astronaut would send Mission Control scrambling to solve the problem. Engineers at Langley struggled to make their deadlines, but they couldn't afford to make any mistakes. The projected launch date slipped from 1960 to 1961. During this period, the Soviets struck again. On April 12, 1961, Russian cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin became the first human in space and the first human to orbit Earth. We could have beaten them. We should have beaten them. Project Mercury's flight director, the engineer in charge of coordinating many of the aspects of the mission, said years later. NASA engineers didn't feel defeated, and they didn't experience the panic that followed the launch of Sputnik. The Soviet success was frustrating and embarrassing, but the Langley team responded with renewed passion for their mission. NASA and its network of contractors focused their talents and kept working. They were almost ready to launch. The Mercury Mission. It would take a total of 1.2 million tests, simulations, investigations, inspections, verifications, experiments, checkouts, and dry runs to send the first American into space. It also took several failed rocket tests and a hair-raising suborbital flight with a chimpanzee on board. The capsule landed so far from the recovery ships that it was nearly underwater when it was finally plucked from the ocean. Ham, the astro chimp, survived the flight. His name is an acronym for the lab that prepped him for his mission, the Holloman Aerospace Medical Center. In a courageous move, NASA decided to broadcast the launch of Mercury Redstone 3 live on television. This would be the third time the Redstone rocket would be used to boost the Mercury capsule into flight over the Atlantic Ocean. At least 45 million Americans tuned in to watch the success or failure of the first United States manned space mission. Astronaut Alan Shepard strapped into the capsule just 6 feet in diameter and less than 7 feet high. The launch was successful, and the spacecraft soared to an altitude of 116.5 miles above the Earth. The suborbital flight of the capsule Shepard, named Freedom 7, lasted only 15 minutes and 22 seconds and covered 303 miles. Freedom 7 was a pale technological achievement compared to the Russians' cosmonauts' flight the month before, but its success helped President John F. Kennedy make a promise to the country to complete a goal significantly more ambitious, a manned mission to the moon. I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal before this decade is out, of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to Earth. President Kennedy said before a session of Congress, 3 weeks after Shepard splashed down. Every NASA employee involved with the space program started to worry. They were already working nights and weekends to prepare for 6 more scheduled Mercury flights. NASA still hadn't completed its first orbital flight, and President Kennedy had promised they were going to send a man to the moon. Was that an impossible dream? It was a terrifying prospect and the most exhilarating thing they had ever heard. Getting to the moon, one of mankind's deepest and most enduring fantasies, had long been the private dream of many at Langley as well. But with only one operational success under its belt and with 6 Mercury missions to go, NASA's road to the moon seemed unimaginably complex. The engineers estimated that the upcoming orbital flight, including the fully manned global tracking network, required a team of 18,000 people. It would take many times more than that to complete a lunar landing. A new mission control. It became clear that NASA was going to have to expand its facilities and workforce if the program was going to reach the goal of putting a man on the moon. And then rumors spread that the Space Task Group was going to be leaving Hampton, Virginia. The Langley employees campaigned to keep mission control at their base, but NASA was considering other sites. In 1960, 9 locations were shortlisted as possibilities, but Virginia was not one of them. Powerful Texans in Congress used their influence, and Houston was chosen as the site. With Project Mercury in full swing and a brand new research center ready to open in Houston, NASA named it the Manned Spacecraft Center. The space program had more work than it could handle. Katherine Johnson had been asked to transfer to Houston with the group, but she and her husband decided to remain in Virginia in order to stay close to their families. Mission Control might have moved to Houston, but Langley was still a beehive of space activity for Katherine Johnson and her colleagues, who were busy laying the groundwork for meeting NASA's greatest challenge, sending a man to the moon and bringing him safely home. That is the end of chapter 20. I did not record my face because I just got out of the shower and I'm in my pajamas. So I apologize. I forgot to make the video beforehand. I hope you enjoyed it. And next is chapter 21.